Hello, my name is David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, a podcast of ideas. Today, we're talking about what life was really like behind the Iron Curtain with Katja Hoyer, who's the author of a much-acclaimed new history of East Germany, and Leah Ippy, whose memoir, Free, tells the story of her growing up in communist and post-communist Albania. Past, Present, Future is brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Listeners can subscribe to Europe's leading literary magazine for a special rate at lrb.me/ppf. That's lrb.me/ppf. Katja, East Germany lasted for 41 years, 41 years, which is kind of half a human life, a long human life. If you were unlucky because you didn't live long, you might be born, live and die in East Germany. But for almost everyone, it's a part of their lives. So you start with Angela Merkel. So for her, it's the first part of her life. She's formed by East Germany, and then she becomes Angela Merkel in another setting. But the people who created the state, it's the second part of their lives. So the people who made the GDR were not made by the GDR. They were made by something else. How would you characterize the life experience of the people who built this state?
Well, it was important to me to characterize it because most of the histories of the GDR start in 1949 when the state is formed. And I think that's somewhat misleading because you kind of then assume that it comes out of nowhere when really it comes on the back of the Second World War and the experiences that people made there. And it's actually that the state itself is a product of the Second World War. It wouldn't have existed without that. And the people who founded it, so people like Walter Ulbricht, who's sort of the first he was the leader for the first half of the state's existence, and Wilhelm Pieck, who's the first and only president of the GDR, not only get made by the experiences in the Second World War, but actually by the fact that they are in Russia during that time. So these German communists sort of fled Germany when Hitler came into power, and also because they had this huge admiration for the Soviet Union as the kind of first and only realization of the sort of utopian dream that they had for decades beforehand. And they go there and they find that actually the reality that they find in Soviet Russia is very different. Not only are the living standards not quite what they'd expected, it really isn't a workers' and sort of peasants, paradise at that point. Buildings are crumbling. There's often food shortages and things like that, which they, in their minds hadn't quite experienced or imagined. And then on top of that, you got the Stalinist purges in the mid to late 1930s, and they get particularly targeted at these German communists and Germans overall, anybody who's got some sort of German connection, because Stalin in his mind imagines that there's like a fifth column for Hitler and they're all, kind of pretend communists that really at heart they're fascists. And that paranoia spirals out of control, and actually the vast majority of German communists either die or kind of disappear in that sort of maelstrom. And the ones that don't and stay, that's kind of the hard residue really of the German communist exclave there, and that's quite interesting in itself. So if you survived these purges, it's for a reason usually. It's very rarely that it's kind of just chance or coincidence. It's because you've adapted to the system, you were ideologically flexible in a way that maybe some other people weren't, adapting to Stalin's kind of back and forth, not least with the Hitler-Stalin pact. That was quite a mental thing to do, to try and get used to the idea that for a while, they're allies really when they make that pact, and then that whole thing breaks apart again. And it's those people who come out of that's a very specific type of person that then sets up the East German state.
Yeah, one of the things that I was really interested in, though, is that it seems like the socialist character of the GDR is not settled at all at the beginning, and that Stalin has a big role to play, but not the role that one would expect Stalin to have. And I was thinking about Italy because I think Stalin played a similar role in the Italian Communist Party. He more or less told the communists, Togliatti and so on, to stop thinking about communism and revolution and just follow the democratic path. And I wondered if Stalin had had his say in the GDR, the kind of the socialist part of it might have been in question. It might have turned out to just be a liberal social democratic republic like Western Germany. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that because I was very curious, and I thought it'd be really interesting for people who haven't heard that side of the story.
Yeah, it is really interesting because most people assume that the GDR, like the other Eastern European states, and to some extent, as you say, communist movements elsewhere as well, are like direct sort of vassal movements or vassal states even of the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin's sort of boot. Whilst Stalin initially says actually what he wants out of Germany, which had just been defeated just about, by the Soviet Union, which had given its all at that point to try and defeat Hitler's Germany, needed reparations. And anything that was contrary to that, particularly this rapid buildup of communism that Walter Ulbricht is trying to push forward in this kind of very young, unstable state, is actually contrary to that idea. So if you take, say, the collectivization of agriculture, you end up with these huge pieces of land that the Junker class, the Prussian aristocracy, held beforehand for decades, and the social structures that come with that get dissolved. You end up with tiny little parcels of land given to new farmers. They were called basically mostly people who'd come from the eastern territories that Germany had lost during the Second World War, and who hadn't really had any experience in farming, and certainly not in the entire economic kind of side of things that comes with that. And the farming sector collapses as a result of that. You get given like a football field worth of land, and you get told, do something with this. You have no idea how you're going to do that. And that's an ideological decision that Ulbricht makes. Stalin says, don't do that because ultimately we want you to produce as much as possible. And you end up with this absurd situation where Walter Ulbricht is more Stalinist than Stalin. And Stalin basically tells him to tone it down, which isn't something that we normally associate with that kind of relationship.
Because that's one of the weird tensions here. The people who survived were the people who were willing to adapt to all of Stalin's whims. But then when they get a bit of power, they're not. And it is, the Italian comparison is interesting. All the way through your book, there are these moments of possible paths not taken. Most people think of the GDR as this deeply predetermined story. The state is set up, it's going to fail, and you're kind of waiting for the clock to tick down, and it turns out 40 years is its shelf life. We'll talk in a bit about the possibility of ways it might have succeeded, but there's also the shadow of German reunification hanging over it. And at its origin, Stalin's pushing for a version of a kind of neutralized single German state. And it's the people who survived by never going against Stalin who go against Stalin to prevent that.
Yeah, and it's absurd in many ways when, you think about the big picture of that. But when you break it down to the situation that they're in, you've got a group of communists, German communists, who've sat there for decades dreaming about creating a socialist state on German soil. And when 1917 happens in Russia, and you get the first realization of that dream somewhere, but not in Germany, they think actually the situation isn't too different from what the state that Germany gets into at the end of the First World War. And they think surely now people are so angry with the existing regime, this is the moment for revolution. And it doesn't happen. So when it finally happens and they get given this piece of land to establish socialism on German soil, they think now is the only moment we need to grasp the situation now. And that's why they even go against sort of their big idol Stalin in that way, because they realize actually, if they let it go now, Germany reunifies and forms a sort of neutral, bourgeois, sort of neutral state effectively, then that chance is gone forever. And they know that.
But it's not a propitious piece of land, right? So like you say, it's the agricultural bit. The industry is over in the West. Very limited natural resources. From the beginning, the East German state is haunted by the fact it can't power itself, right? It has to rely on lignite. And so it's going to be dependent on the Soviet Union, essentially, for oil. So they've got their piece of land, but in a way it's the wrong bit for the socialist paradigm.
Yeah, in many ways, especially if you're setting up a sort of workers, state. And I think in many ways they forget kind of how rural and how traditional in many ways these kind of social structures are as well, because their ideology, as you find a lot with communism, is based on an urban proletariat. And yes, that you have that in Berlin and you have it in Dresden and other areas like that. But really, the GDR itself is, as a society, not quite what, these communists who hadn't lived amongst these people for 12 years is. When they come back, they've experienced 12 years of Nazi ideology and so on and so forth. Society isn't exactly, kind of ideal for communist conditions, and it just gets put over the top of perhaps an East German public that doesn't quite know what to do with that. You also have all of these refugees coming from Eastern Europe. That's, another 12 million people on the move with nothing. They need to be integrated into the existing society. It's again something that doesn't quite work within the kind of ideology that, that they set up.
I think that's generally the case in all Eastern European socialist states. These were all mostly rural, not the most industrialized capitalist part of Europe. And in the Balkans, it becomes really extreme because they're almost feudal. And to me, this is one of the paradoxes of real socialism in the 20th century, is the fact that it doesn't happen, it doesn't get realized where the textbook says that it should be realized, England and France, or the most industrialized capitalist part of Germany. And in a lot of these places, it actually comes to power through elections. Of course, it's after the war, and of course, the war has divided the world in spheres of influence and so on. But there is something about the fact that the society is under these conditions that makes people decide that they want to pursue the communist or the socialist transition to communist path rather than the liberal democratic path. And that's a very interesting, one of the kind of most weird things about socialism, the real socialism.
Except I think, you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the one person who said it's coming in East, not West Germany was Rosa Luxemburg, who said, they've got it wrong. Like they've got this overly schematic thing that the more industrialized you are, her reason was actually you have to see where people are suffering from imperial oppression. That's where the uprising will happen.
Yeah.
But she was almost unique, I think. God knows what she would have thought of the GDR, right? But she was the one who said, this is way too schematic.
Yeah, but I can't remember now if she said this before or after the Bolshevik Revolution, because so it was like after the first Russian Revolution. Yeah. And I think it's because there was this movement then that made people, you could see that they were mobilizing, and the workers were mobilizing alongside the peasants, and they were playing some role in but I think you're right that yeah. So I don't think she theorized this in the abstract. I think she saw the movement, and then she felt the need to justify what was going on in these contexts, and did so effectively.
So in many ways, what you describe, Katja, in the book is pretty unpropitious beginnings for this state. And yet then you want us to see that at various points, it's much more stable than you might think. And at some points, it's more prosperous than you might think. The story has to pass through 1953, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on that, but we can't completely ignore it.
No,
right? The first resistance to this version of East European Soviet domination comes in East Berlin in 53. And so the East German state is the first one to experience the crushing of that. And that does set the path for the next 35 years.
Yeah, I think the story is slightly different, though. It often gets put into, or people draw a straight line from 1953 to 1989 as though they were part of the same sort of resistance movement against the state, which I don't think they are. In 1953, I've found it really interesting talking to older people who were around during that time, and they said actually in 49, 50, 51, there was a genuine sense of optimism. They had a country that was completely gone with all of its social structures, also in its physical structures. It was a complete sort of tabula rasa type situation, and thereby a chance to build a new Germany completely from scratch. And that appealed to a lot of people, even thinkers like Bertolt Brecht and, people like that who saw a chance here to do something completely different. And so, they wanted to roll their sleeves up and get going. And even if it's against everybody, Stalin on the one side, the West on the other side, they'll do it. And then that doesn't happen. They struggle, they work sort of hours and hours every day. The shelves are still empty. The currency gets devalued massively, and it doesn't seem to go anywhere. People's efforts and people's kind of genuine attempt to make do, but try and get, forward and do something with this new state. And the regime is so obstinate about this entire situation as well, and just telling people, just get on with it, just do it. And there doesn't seem to be any outcome, and you do that over 2-3 years and people are going to get incredibly angry. And my favorite situation, I've got that in the book as well, is where the workers then actually on the Stalinallee of all places in Berlin kind of march towards the state building and stand in front of Ulbricht effectively and say, come out and talk to us. And Ulbricht goes, oh, I think it's beginning to rain. That'll disperse them. And you just think, how detached from the realities on the ground can you get? And I think it's that feeling that they weren't heard, their concerns weren't being heard. This was supposed to be a state for them, for workers, for ordinary people, and that doesn't come about. That's, I think, the sense of frustration that you see unload onto the streets, whilst the situation, say in Hungary or in Czechoslovakia, I think is a different one later on.
Well, I was thinking it's almost, when I was reading your book, it was almost the inverse development of Albania, because the GDR starts in this, as you say, isolated way. Not isolated, but sort of trying to assert its will against the Soviet Union and against the Western capitalist countries, and then eventually realizes, and the story, as I understood, of the 60s and 70s is one where it needs to make more compromises and open up to the world. So it opens up to the Soviet Union a bit, but also to West Germany. And in Albania, it was almost the opposite. So the state started with first a very loose affiliation to Yugoslavia. Then it was pragmatically following the Soviet Union when it fell out with Yugoslavia for territorial reasons. And then it kind of isolated itself from the Soviet Union and allied with China, then isolated itself from China when the Chinese became more moderate. And then in the 80s, when I was growing up, when the GDR was to Albanians a kind of beacon, a paradise of socialism, really. It was very, very isolated and fighting against everyone and on its own. And to me, it was really interesting because from Albania, I remember in the 80s, we didn't really distinguish very much between West Germany and East Germany, even though these were very, very different states. They were still better than us. And to some extent, they have more consumer goods and, they had jeans and you would go and the streets looked different. And it was a very interesting, when I was comparing these stories, how this was one movement of isolation then towards greater openness and compromise. And on the other hand, you had this other country that started with some more compromise and then became more and more isolated. But then 1989, 1990, both these counterfactual stories end up in the same place with the triumph of capitalism.
Do you think part of the reason for that counterfactual is that East Germany is half a country? It's always half a country. So it's always haunted by the fact that there is a completion narrative that might be coming. Whereas Albania, as it were, national identity gets stronger and stronger. In some ways, that haunting of there is a Germany which is more than us, it never really weakens, does it? And these are divided families. I mean, I was really struck by the number of instances where the regime in East Germany said to the Soviets, to Moscow, you've got to understand our citizens have relatives on the other side and we can't stop contact with them. They are going to communicate. They're going to share stuff. They're going to be sent genes from over the border. And that's the thing that makes the GDR in some ways different from some of these other stories that are so driven by nationalism and national identity.
I completely agree. I mean, it's the same actually it's the inverse, but a similar situation in Poland where it's a constant struggle for national identity and that eventually becomes kind of the focal point of their resistance to the Soviet Union and the same, patterns you still see today in Poland's support for Ukraine now, for example, the way that that's shifted the relationship there. But I think for Germany, this is really interesting because, nobody understands this better than Erich Honecker, who the second leader, basically, for the second half of the time of the GDR's existence, who was from the Saarland in the far west himself, actually only sort of 100 kilometers away, his birthplace from the birthplace of Helmut Kohl, the West German Chancellor at the time. So in a way, they were sort of locals once, to the same region in West Germany and are now leaders of opposing countries. And Honecker still has a sister in the West. When his parents die, he decides not to go to the funeral because he feels that he can't do that if other people aren't allowed to go. He can't be seen to go west whenever he pleases and then not allow people to do the same thing. So that's why I think you see him almost pleading with the Soviets to understand that that's a constant pressure on East Germany, this kind of pressure to reunify or at the very least to allow the people to reconnect in some shape or form. And once you start doing that, you lose the middle classes and the upper classes because they will take the opportunity and go into a state that, allows them effectively to further their own social standing and their income. So that conflict or contrast between East and West is always there. There's always another Germany on the other side that you can choose as an option when you want to. Whereas if you're Polish or Albanian or Czech, you would have to make a conscious decision to move to a foreign country with a different culture, different language, visa requirements, and so on.
When you were a child, you say East Germany was both a beacon but also seemed remote. The experience seemed remote. So then when you read about it in Katja's book and compare it to your experience, does it still seem remote for some of these reasons? Actually, a very different kind of society?
No, in some ways it's very similar. So it's sort of really weird because there are some things that clearly resonate. The way children were brought up, the sort of ideology, the pioneers, these youth groups that were organized on communist principles. Also the criticism, the craving for consumer goods and the looking outside and the drive, the desire to emigrate, to be somewhere else. And this idea that there's more choice in Western capitalist countries. All of these sentiments I shared. But when I remembered being in Albania and when I remembered my parents or people talking about the they talked about Germany, and they didn't really say in the GDR or in the FDR. And I remember also in the World Cup, it was always Germany is playing, and then nobody was asking which Germany.
Well, what happened when they played each other in 74? Did people freaked out?
So then it was a bit more confusing for me as a child. But, most of the time, some of the things came from the GDR because people were traveling from Albania when they were traveling more easily to the GDR, and the football teams or the sport teams often did travel more easily to Eastern Germany than Western Germany. And when they came as though they'd gone to this other world that was very, very different. But then when I was reading your book, some of the things from this world were actually quite similar.
So you have a Coke can on the cover of your book. There's the Coke can story in Free. But the difference, just reading the two accounts, in Albania, there's a strong sense that this human instinct to be consumer has to be suppressed. And what I was really taken aback by in many ways, particularly with Honecker, was the extent to which he thought the stability of the regime depended on, if not quite pandering to consumerism, indulging it.
Yeah.
And it comes in waves, right? There are big imports of American jeans at various points when the state can afford it. Amazing that it can afford it. But it comes and goes. I mean, clearly Honecker is slightly unsure about this. But overall, there are one or two points where you can see that he thinks the only way we're going to survive is if we do meet some of these consumer aspirations. And it's a kind of fatal mistake, perhaps. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, because it's not an adaptable enough regime. There's a sort of opening of the door to this. But you can't just import jeans and then think that will do it. You build the Trabant, you say it's a better car than people remember. But what's so interesting about the history of it is that it couldn't adapt. The car ends up not being able to evolve as people's expectations shift. That seemed to me to make the GDR an unusual communist regime.
I think it is, and it boils down to what we were saying about this comparison to West Germany. I mean, people are looking at their own relatives in the West. We had relatives that sent parcels over, and you opened this up and it seemed like they had all of this stuff. We found out later, for instance, that my uncle, who used to send us like coffee and chocolate and things, and it sort of pretended almost like he was this, very cosmopolitan man who had access to everything. And then we found out that he bought all of this at Aldi, at the time, because he was a working class man in West Germany, but had obviously access to sort of cheap versions of the things that were lacking in the GDR, and just sent them over and sort of, enjoyed the fact that nobody had any idea how he actually lived in West Germany. And then the other thing that people forget is that access to Western television, music, culture was there because of broadcast media. I mean, there were only two areas, and because of the proximity, in East Germany that didn't have access to Western television and radio. And they were sort of jokingly known as the Valley of the Clueless. It's like deepest, darkest Saxony and a little bit in the north. But everybody else had access to Western television. So they sat there and watched the news on West German TV. And more importantly, perhaps, all of the adverts. And you begin to imagine, because you have no idea how consumerism works. We, of course, sit here and watch a TV advert and think this is ridiculous. This kind of conversation would never happen in real life, or, nobody has got white teeth like that. But if that's the only little window that you have into a consumerist world, and you assume because it's the West it must be true, then you assume that that's what the entire world's like. And I think Honecker realizes that these expectations are growing because people have got access to just a little bit of snippets of that world. He's trying to pander to that. And as you say, then he creates more expectations. Jeans is a perfect example. He imports 1 million Levi's jeans from the US for a population of 16 million people. That's ridiculous.
Well, that is going to fuel demand. Yeah, it's not going to satisfy it.
Exactly. There's a complete run on it. There's complete chaos. All of the sort of shops where it's sold, they get overrun by these, East German suddenly consumers. And then what's he going to do? Do that every year, until everybody's got 10 pairs of jeans, and then they'll want something else next. So it's interesting that Honecker does that, but at the same time, kind of staunch old school communists like Erich Mielke, the head of the Stasi, get really concerned about this. And Mielke actually goes so far as to kind of start collating incriminating evidence, against Honecker, to try and see that if this whole thing fails eventually, he can show that he was on the right side of history and he knew it all along. And he collates them all in this famous red suitcase that he keeps in his office, that is only found after the wall came down.
So I was thinking about this. I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this question, but What is the Marxist view of consumerism? I mean, it's a big question, but for some people, particularly critics of Marxism in general, there's a view it must be a very kind of ascetic, repressive, anti-pleasure philosophy, but it's not. And Marx and Engels, Engels definitely wasn't against pleasure. And there are versions of Marxism which do fit this, right? The point of these workers' paradises is that the workers will have access to these goods.
Yeah, although I've thought a lot about this thing after reading Katja's book about this whole question of consumer goods in Eastern Europe and in kind of socialist countries. And sometimes we think that people wanted consumer goods because they were inherently driven to these goods because they were made in a certain way, because marketing has presented them in a certain way, and because it worked in this kind of old-fashioned Marxist way. You are able to package something and you're presenting it to this individual, and the individual will be attracted to it, and they won't think what's behind it. They will just fall for it. And this used to be my view about the way socialist citizens related to consumer goods. But I recently started to think that it wasn't actually just about the goods. I think wanting the good was an expression of dissent towards your own system. So I don't think it was just the fact that we liked Coke can because Coke can looked nice and, tasted nice, and we didn't have it. We would like, no matter what, if we didn't have it, just to signal to the government that you can't deny me this. So to me, it was a little bit more complex than that. And I think the example of jeans is actually really good. When East Germany starts producing its own brand jeans, they look the same. Okay, maybe they're not as well made and they're not as durable, but people just don't like them. They want the ones that have the American brand. And there's something, and I was thinking about Rousseau when I was reading this, there's something about the comparison that's driving the desire there rather than the access to the stuff. It's not about the stuff as such. It's about the stuff as shaped by social relations and by you wanting it because someone else has it and you can't have it because you've been denied by the state to have it. And I think, especially in the case of Albania, which was completely isolated and where the state did not pander at all to this consumer, we just didn't have any jeans of any kind. We didn't even try the own brand. We were like, jeans are imperialist, and that's it. That's the end of the discussion. Then I think having these things became like a mark of, it was like a political protest. You wore a pair of jeans and you were saying to the state, what are you going to do now?
You can't stop me.
And often people were, they were called to their offices and they were reprimanded for wearing jeans or for exposing. So it wasn't always repressed, but it was risky. You could be stopped and you could be called to your office and someone could have a chat with you and say, look, where are you going with these jeans or with this swimming costume? And yet people still did it. So they were exposing themselves to some risk by wearing the jeans or by having the Coca-Cola can exposed in their living rooms. And it was, I think, a very obvious mark of protest in a country where there was no open protest. And I think this is something that maybe we haven't thought about enough, the fact that it wasn't just about the consumer good, but there was something else that wanting this consumer good was signaling that went beyond access to the stuff.
But that then suggests there's a real problem with this type of regime, because you have the version where consumer desire is repressed, and then these goods become a vehicle for an expression of identity or even freedom. And then you have the societies where this is not repressed, it's pandered to, and then you can't contain it. And in a way, therefore, there is, maybe not with Marxism, but with this version of politics, consumerism is its fatal flaw.
But interestingly, and this links into what you were just saying as a form of kind of protest, it immediately loses its shine the moment the wall falls and you've got access to these things. I've heard this time and time again from people. They were so excited, in 1989, they're going over for the first time. They buy all the things that they've been dreaming of for so long. And then suddenly it all seems very empty and it loses the sort of magic that it had beforehand. And, especially the sort of grabbiness of that moment. People describe how they were given this welcome money from West Germany, 100 marks, and they had to have a stamp in their passport to show that, they wouldn't claim it twice. And these were all people who had jobs, who had sort of dignity, who had worked all their lives, and they were like, they felt like they were given chocolate bars and bananas and all of these things as if they just come from somewhere that didn't have anything, or, and suddenly you get this disaffection with this whole thing once again. And I think you see that unfold in the 1990s as political disaffection with this new system that they're in.
And do you remember in the 1990s, I'm sure it was the same in East Germany, how people literally replaced furniture in their houses and were getting rid of the cupboards and the tables. And I think now, 30 years after, things are changing. I could see it in Albania as well. There's these tables and these chairs that have become objects of, they're like antique pieces. And I had this, I don't know if we have time, but my mom had a pair of flip-flops from communist period produced in a plastic factory. And she claimed that these flip-flops would never die because they weren't made for the consumer market. So she was like, they're not like these other flip-flops in the West or in capitalist countries where they make them for a couple of years and they break so you can replace them and buy a new one. These flip-flops were literally indestructible. And at some point she'd lost her flip-flops and she was going, man, I've lost my best flip-flops. And I was like, you would have sold your soul to get rid of these flip-flops and to have, the cheap one Primarks or whatever flip-flops that you find. And now you're thinking this was the real thing.
And yet, Katja, as you write, there are moments of real anxiety in the West during the 60s and 70s that the East is forging ahead. And there are some amazing figures in your book. I think it's fridge ownership.
That was the
That's the one that people think, really? But
they held up.
More fridges in East Germany than in West Germany. And you say that the 50s were a pretty turbulent time. And your book is pushing back against the idea that there's this thing called Stasi-land East Germany, which is just this sort of monolithic block in space and time, and then it collapses. It's very volatile. There are lots of ups and downs, lots of twists in your story. But you do say in 61 it stabilizes. 61 is the year that the wall goes up. And then it does stabilize to a certain extent. And through the 60s and 70s, there are periods where it looks like this thing might work.
It certainly looked like that to the people from the inside. So when you speak to people about particularly I'd say the late 60s, early 70s, it felt like a period of progress because, you got the space race going on. The Soviets get the first man into space. The first German in space is an East German, Sigmund Jähn. And, it looks like for all the world, they have a chance at least catching up in the arms race and the space race in society, many people feel they're actually further ahead. There are many people who feel that the development of women in society, of the working classes getting kind of genuine access to education and cultural things.
And as you say, a militarized society is very good for class mobility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the ironies. We imagine these kind of military societies as kind of, static and oppressive things. But at the same time, the entire officer class gets completely reformed for the very first time in German history, that there's access for people from the lower classes, not just access, but actually a kind of desire to get these people into those positions. So you might be, the son of refugees from the East who came with nothing, and suddenly you're in a uniform, you're commanding a group of men, and you've got all the status that comes with that in society. So all of that's happening, and people, I think, appreciated that from the inside, despite the fact that, of course, the war brings massive human tragedies for many German families as well with it. So that doesn't go away, but it doesn't affect everybody, and people forget that as well. If you haven't got relatives in the West, then that doesn't really affect you very much at that point, particularly working class families who hadn't actually traveled, say, or gone on holiday before the GDR, and suddenly there's subsidized holidays, and people don't sit there and say, I'd much rather be in the south of France, because it doesn't even occur to them that might be the case. They go to the Baltic Sea and have their holiday, or I don't know, skiing in Czechoslovakia or whatever it may be. So, people arrange themselves with the system. Things begin to stabilize. And, as Leah was just saying, in terms of living standards, there was also a feeling within the GDR that they had sort of reached the highest living standards in the communist world, and they were looking at the other people around them and were saying, actually, this is working. And also at the living standards they had before the GDR, during the war, and then also during the Weimar Republic, during the First World War, older people, there just hadn't been this amount of stability and prosperity before. So I think perhaps it is an illusion. I mean, there is always this problem of the socialist orbit not having the amount of possibilities import and export wise of actually setting up the sort of economy that Germany works on, this kind of idea of importing cheap raw materials and then exporting expensive goods elsewhere. That world just doesn't exist for the GDR to operate in. So it was always a problem. How is it going to do this kind of German business model when it can't operate in the same way that West Germany can? But internally, certainly, it looked to the people of the GDR like stability had arrived and they were making progress.
Now, when you were reading it, did you ever think there's a sort of what-if version of this, that this thing had more life in it than we appreciate?
Yes, but on the other hand, then reading the details, I found there were some extraordinary paradoxes. So one of them was the fact that, for example, they had to pander to this, again, consumer desire for access to bananas. And I remember reading in Katja's book that they were buying bananas with the money they made from the sale of political prisoners. And this is one of these things.
That's not a basis for a stable society.
You just think, if this is what's going on,
something's gone wrong.
And this is how people have thought that they can get around this problem of buying banana by selling political prisoners. I mean, I don't know, maybe there is a logic to it, but it wasn't that obvious.
It's not a sustainable logic.
And Nazi paraphernalia and works of art. And it was just totally bizarre how they were trying to just create currency with all of these kind of weird schemes. None of them were sustainable in the long run.
When I was reading it, I thought, and maybe I've read it wrong, but it felt like the GDR, relative maybe to other Eastern European regimes, was better at adapting when it got a stroke of good fortune. So there were points at which it was more open to the possibility that things are going well. And there were times where they thought we should open up a bit further. But what it had in common with those other regimes is that when things turned against them, it was very inflexible. So particularly over energy, very dependent on Soviet oil. And so when you go through the 70s and move into the 80s, and that pipeline literally is cut off, the regime has no idea how to adapt. And it's that one of the questions you ask of any political regime is not where do you want to be where things are going well, but where do you want to be when something unexpectedly bad happens. And this was not a regime that knew how to deal with unexpected turns of ill fortune.
No, and especially not as there was no renewal at the top. I mean, when you think in 1989, you still have Erich Honecker, who is, himself a product really of the Second World War and of kind of this period that now seems a long time in the past for somebody who's in their 20s in the 1980s. And then there's this kind of dinosaur from way back when who sat in a Nazi prison and experienced all of this kind of, Stalinist training at the time as well. He'd gone to Moscow to be trained as a communist, as a young communist, and then you have Erich Mielke, same thing. He fought in the Spanish Civil War and was trained as a sort of Chekist, really, with all the methods of sabotage and subterfuge and all of that came with that. These people are still running the state in the 80s. And you think there's all of these young East Germans who've gone through quite a good education system, are all very literate, read a lot, are very confident, including women, and going out there and actually saying their opinion because they've been told to do that, ironically. And then you have a system sitting at the top, that's dealing now with the highly educated, highly confident and highly vocal society that wants to express, what's wrong with this and what they want to change. And you've got all of these old men sitting at the top saying, no, this is not how we do things. In the 1930s or in the 1920s, we learned it this way and that's how we're going to do it.
And they are all men.
Yeah, indeed. And that, that's another issue. Although I find it quite interesting that, for instance, in 1953, within the Politburo, one of the staunchest opponents really of Walter Ulbricht is a woman, Ellie Schmidt, who's quite sort of vocal and says to him, this is all your fault. Without your intransigence, we wouldn't have had this uprising. So, you get this relatively early. Lotte Ulbricht, I think, is also an underestimated character, and there's Ulbricht's wife, who's herself quite a sort of, vocal communist with her own ideas, rather than just a passive sort of first lady or however you want to frame it. So women do play a role in politics to some extent, but it's interesting that they never fully make it quite into the top ranks.
And you write about Merkel, the person who becomes the most significant female politician in Europe, but her account of life in the GDR, I think you quote her as saying, it wasn't as bad as people think. There was always a place I could go to. You could always find your kind of freedom, but it was a private freedom. And you describe it going on these holidays and these trips. The person who's going to become the public face of Germany says of East Germany, yeah, there were outlets for people like me, but they were entirely inward driven, right? There was no public outlet for someone like her.
Yes and no. I mean, she was also, a sort of leading figure within her local branch of the Free German Youth, and people forget that because she never talked about it. But the fact that she was a secretary for agitation and propaganda was the term, which effectively isn't quite as bad as it sounds, in the sense that you organize events and concerts and things like that as basically part of this entire ideological package. But when she was a student and then a researcher, that was kind of part of what she did, is she worked within the the Free German Youth to put these events on and organize holidays and trips. And some of these trips that she undertook, for instance, to Poland, where she then became really interested in Solidarność and looking at what was going on there intellectually, were actually organized through the Free German Youth. Later, she traveled independently, but there were, even within the regime's own structures, there were these niches, and especially within the Free German Youth, they were often very vocal towards the regime and kind of told them what they thought of it. And that's, again, a chance I think that was missed to some extent, was that young people were there, they were saying what they wanted, and yet their voices just weren't heard or recognized.
Yeah, I think for me, the also interesting aspect is the fact that the private becomes so political, and that because in some way you have these societies where you can't have open dissent because there's a system of sanctions, people take their dissent into their private spaces, and so into their families, into their birthday parties, into the weddings, and depending on who they are, they develop a whole way of talking to each other. In the case of Albania, it was often coded language because it was much, I think, higher degree of repression. But it meant that still, to some extent now, for people who are growing up in that society and in those social norms, it was very normal to talk about very big political questions and about geopolitics. And something that I remember when I moved outside Albania and into the kind of West and, in Britain, it seemed almost that it was not polite to ask someone, who do you vote for and why do you vote for this?
No politics.
Why do you vote for this person and why do you believe in this system? And
partly because people think the wedding will go badly if you start and they're not wrong either.
So I had this sort of difficulty of adapting because, I had grown up in this society where even though it wasn't outside vocal in the newspapers, it was clear that everyone was breathing and thinking politics. And then you move on, and then finally there's the freedom to talk and to have all these discussions, and then nobody actually wants to have the discussions.
You quote some people, there are defenders of the GDR still, and they want to say something that sometimes people say now about China, which is, yes, it's not democratic if by democratic you mean elections, but that's our sort of quaint Western belief that it's all about elections. You describe this in some senses, this is a very democratic society because entry into positions of power is open much more widely than it is in more hierarchical, structured, family-based societies, which includes the West, right? Politicians are often the children of politicians and so on. And lots of people in East Germany found a way to a position of power that would have been much harder under previous kinds of social and regime arrangements. And yet it did have a real problem with renewal. That's what it feels like. So there is an openness that we miss. And people say this of China. They don't have elections, but there's a lot of ways in for people. If you're bright, if you're smart, if you're identified early, if you're loyal, you can rise quite quickly, and that they're very keen on talent. In some ways, it's more meritocratic than the West. And yet what it couldn't do was renew itself.
No, that's right. And if you also identify these people early, then you start, this whole sort of cadre politics that is also an obsession, I would say, within the communist sort of ideology, that you identify people early and then sort of guide them through the process to leadership. You just make them into mini clones of yourself eventually. I mean, you eventually get sorted out of the system if you turn out to have an independent mind that doesn't quite fit in. Or, in East Germany, it was enough to have relatives in the West because they just wouldn't trust you into higher positions because you could always, be turned into a spy, or you could actually leave eventually, and then that would be highly embarrassing for the state if kind of one of its own left. So, it was always dependent. Yes, there's an element of meritocracy there, and many people described to me that they felt now that there was a sense of frustration with the way that, people say, oh, you only got into this position because you got the right family background, when actually the academic standards, for example, were very high, especially in the sciences, for you to sort of progress and go, first of all, do sort of the equivalent to A-levels and then go to university. You had to be very, very good intellectually as well to manage. But at the same time, if, you didn't fit in or whatever, then that was also closed to you. So it's, again, one of these paradoxes, I suppose, between, the opportunities that were open to some social classes and people from some social backgrounds, but not to others who may have had the same qualifications.
Did Albania feel like that?
I think it was a more rigid structure, and there was a sense that if you came from a bourgeois or property-owning family, there is something called a biography that was always going to follow you throughout your life. And so it was usually these university degrees, they were open or not open, depending not just how you performed in school, but also what kind of family background you had. And so you had to always write when you applied for universities what was called a biography, where you said, my father did this, my grandfather did this, they fought in the war on which side. And if they didn't fight on the right side, they usually had to find something else to make up for that fact. But it was, I think, much more constrained and not as socially mobile as I read from your book. And, my mom studied maths. She never could have studied something that was not a hard science, because the idea was to study humanities. You had to be the daughter of a party official or in a family that could be reliable to teach people about Marxism. And you would never have a class enemy teach philosophy or be a journalist. And so, in fact, usually what happened, all the scientists were, if the people who managed to go to university were from backgrounds that were somewhat more dubious, and then the politics or the humanities were more open to families of party officials or people who had what was called a good biography. So, and I didn't get the impression that the biography was a really important element in Albania, and I didn't get the impression that shaped as much the fate.
There is the same system, actually. So people did also have to write their little CVs and things and present their own biography to the state or to an official. But I think there was more room because the regime was just a little bit more, I think, confident to allow some people who were not obviously complete dissidents and people who were very vocal and against the state. But there were many people, especially artists, I found it's really interesting how they negotiated their own path between censorship and their creativity. They're often now also dismissed. If you take somebody like Christa Wolf, who was, often presented as a state artist who worked with the state, but, her work is also highly critical of the state at the same time in many ways and of the human tragedies that it caused. And that applies to many films as well, which, you take the most successful film in the GDR is The Legend of Paul and Paula, highly risky at the time for its sexual themes, but also its political themes. And yet Erich Honecker himself went out of his way and rescued it from censorship and said, actually, this is going to be really popular. It will also be watched internationally. It may win prizes, internationally. And they wanted that recognition for the GDR on the world stage. And they knew if they suppressed all talent, that wasn't going to happen. And so, I think the negotiation between the political side and people's genuine talents and intelligence was maybe a little bit more fluid in the GDR.
So I want to finish with a what-if question, which is really two what-if questions. When I was a child, it seemed like Germany was two countries. That's what I grew up believing from the West. And it would always be like this. And it was weird. And I remember a lot of people have this memory from the outside, the shock of discovering that West Berlin was in East Germany. There's that moment of thinking, because I just assumed as a child, not having looked at a map, that the line went all the way down the middle. I think a lot of people thought that, and that Berlin was on the border. And then trying to work out, how does it work? Because how do people cross? And it just didn't make sense. But you thought, but it must work because this is the way the world is. This is the way the world will always be. There's a wall, that's not coming down. And then, of course, it comes down and astonishes everyone. But your book suggests these two kind of what-if questions, and take either of them. One of which is, maybe it could have lasted longer. Maybe if those opportunities to open up were taken a bit further, a move closer to something like a form of social democracy. Were there actual missed opportunities? You use that phrase in the book, missed opportunities, which suggests that something could have been done differently with a potentially different outcome. And then the other thing that haunts it, not in the later stages, but the earlier stages, is German reunification at an earlier point. The various conversations that were had, some secret, some open, but particularly in the earlier stages, and with the knowledge that Stalin and indeed some of his successors at various points were nervous about this division. Do either of you think this story could have gone differently?
Only in terms of timing for me, like either earlier or later is very possible, but I don't see how the GDR could have been a permanent thing just because you basically have a very artificial division of a country, of a nation that only came about out of the very specific circumstances of the Second World War. And of course, you take something like Korea as an example, or Vietnam for a long time. There are other nations, countries that are split into and do this for much longer. But you look at the type of regime you have in North Korea and you sort of see why that is. I don't think that would have worked in Germany, not least because of the access to one another's kind of experiences and cultures that was always there, whilst North Korea is, of course, very, just as a counterexample, very isolationist and literally cuts its own people off completely. Whilst if you were in East Germany, you had access, as I said, to Western news and media and everything. Your relatives would come over. Traveling the other way was getting easier. So lots of people, and again, this is often forgotten in the story of the wall, traveled over to West Germany for events, for cultural exchanges. There were lots of scientific, exchanges between universities. The churches were talking to each other. People went over for birthdays, weddings, funerals and things. So I think, there's, even at the time, people were conscious of that. You had this sort of called magnet theory of the two German magnets being drawn towards each other. And the question was supposedly, which has the biggest pulling power. But eventually they'd pull back together. And also the fact that you have the East German kind of socialists sitting down together with the Social Democratic Party in West Germany and coming up with this kind of paper in the 80s that exploded, where they're both saying, well, there's system competition at the moment between social democracy and socialism on the other side. Let that play out. One of them will eventually prevail. But the idea is the same. They can peacefully coexist. But eventually one or the other will prove to be the better system and will bring Germany back together under one leadership.
And Leah, just to add one other what if, I remember Günter Grass, among other people, after the wall came down, putting his name to a little book that was called One Nation, Two States, wanting to say we need to preserve this other version of politics within this new Germany. We want this plural system. We don't want everything to collapse into the West. It now seems like a very quaint idea. Any possibility of that?
Well, I think there is a way of looking at it, which is, 1989, Stalin's dream finally becomes true. You have a unified German liberal democratic republic. But what you also have is a form of colonialism. If you don't think of colonialism just as occupying territory and war and violence, but you think of the way in which an entire place becomes subjected to a system of laws that is different from what they had up to that point. What you have in the relationship between West Germany and East Germany is that you get Western German law, the basic constitution, the main social positions are defined by the West German law, and the Eastern Germans are just the recipients of this system of rules. And I think it could have played out differently if there had been more flexibility in the way in which these two bodies of politics were put together, and if people had been a bit more imaginative in Western Europe about not thinking of this just as a war that ends with the winners and the losers, and now the losers have to take the guilt, the blame, the shame that comes with the end of a war. And it was a Cold War, but the mentality that defined the end of the Cold War was that of a hot war, actually a real war. And I think that is not just the case in East Germany, but across the post-communist European world, the pattern was one where the West gave the laws literally, sometimes really literally. In the case of the Albanian constitution, they were copy-pasted by Western constitutions. And I think if that process had been a little bit more inclusive and with more reflection in terms of what can we learn from these experiences, how can the West become better, how can the West take the best of the East as well as the East take the best of the West, I think we would have ended up with a very different Europe from the one we have now.
Yeah, no, I agree. Especially within Germany, where you've got literally people from the same nation talking to each other. And initially, also the idea was not to have a split Germany, both of the West German state and the East German state. Initially in 1949, come up with a constitution each that is a literal mirror image of each other, and both kind of have a clause in there that says this is temporary, and once Germany is reunified, we'll come up with a new constitution. There were actually law cases fought after the wall fell around this. Is it even legal to just absorb East Germany into West Germany, or do they need to come up with a new constitution? And many people in the West, particularly the Social Democratic Party at the time, were actually pushing for that and saying, there should be a new constitution, and you could have created a new Germany out of that. The problem was that it was all going very, very quickly, and Helmut Kohl, the West German Chancellor, made that part of his own agenda, not least to save his own political career. He had a lot of kind of scandals and problems around himself and the party in West Germany, and became the unification chancellor, and thereby, sort of saved his own career as well to some extent. But the fact that it was pushed through so quickly and with so little debate, and as Leah was just saying, with this idea of one side's defeated the other, therefore the losers devalidated in everything that they did culturally, economically and politically.
Katja Hoyer's book is Beyond the Wall, East Germany, 1949 to 1990. It's available now. And Leah Rippey's Free is available in paperback. Both of them. Get them wherever you get good books. Please follow us on Twitter at PPF Ideas. We will post links, we will post clips, we will post information about future episodes. Next week is the first in the new series of the History of Ideas, in which I'm going to be talking about the great political essays by the greatest essayists. And I'm starting with the person who is perhaps the greatest essayist of all, the man who invented the form, Montaigne. Please join us for that. We've been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.